If truth is revealed, the marriage becomes permanent. Ethan read that line 3 times before it made sense, and then a 4th time just to make sure he wasn't hallucinating, because contracts didn't just do that, not in real life, not in any world that followed basic logic. And yet there it was in clean, black ink at the bottom of a document he had already signed, his name sitting there like a betrayal he'd written with his own hand, neat, controlled, irreversible. His fingers tightened around the edge of the paper, knuckles paling as a strange pressure built in his chest, not quite panic, not quite anger, something sharper, something that felt like recognition without memory. And that was the part that scared him the most. Slowly, he lifted his head, and across the polished glass desk, Lucas Vaughn was watching him, completely still, like a man who had been waiting for this exact moment, like nothing in the last 5 minutes had surprised him at all. Ethan swallowed, the silence stretching too long, too heavy, pressing against his ribs until he had to break it. "This clause," he said, but his voice came out quieter than he intended, thinner. "This isn't standard." And even as he said it, he knew how ridiculous that sounded, because nothing about this situation was standard, not the contract, not the man sitting across from him, not the fact that his sworn enemy was now, legally, technically, his husband. Lucas didn't move, didn't even blink, just tilted his head slightly, that same unreadable calm settling over his features. "You should have read everything," he replied, voice low and even, like they were discussing quarterly numbers instead of something that could change the rest of Ethan's life. Ethan let out a short breath that almost turned into a laugh, sharp and humorless. "I trusted the summary," he shot back, but the words felt weak the second they left his mouth, because no, he hadn't trusted anything, not really. He'd just been desperate enough to sign, desperate enough to ignore the instinct in his gut that had whispered something is wrong. Lucas leaned forward then, just an inch, but it shifted the air between them, tightened it, made it harder to breathe. "That was your first mistake," he said quietly. Ethan's pulse kicked, hard, and he pushed back from the desk, chair scraping softly against the floor as he stood, needing distance, needing space, because something about the way Lucas was looking at him felt too close, too familiar, like standing in a room you didn't remember entering, but somehow knew exactly where everything was. "This is a contract," Ethan said, more firmly now, forcing steadiness into his voice, into his spine. "It's fake, temporary, transactional. So whatever game you think you're playing, then why do you look like you've been here before?" Lucas cut in, and the question landed like a crack through glass. Ethan froze. Just for a second, something flickered at the edge of his mind, a sensation more than a memory, warmth at the back of his neck, a voice too close, saying something he couldn't quite hear, couldn't quite catch, and his breath hitched before he could stop it. No, that wasn't real. That didn't belong to him. It couldn't. "I don't," Ethan said quickly, too quickly, shaking his head as if he could physically dislodge the feeling. "I don't know what you're talking about." But Lucas was already standing now, moving around the desk with a kind of quiet certainty that made Ethan's stomach tighten. He didn't touch him, not yet, but he stopped close enough that Ethan could feel the heat radiating from him, could see the faint tension in his jaw, the way his eyes darkened just slightly as they searched Ethan's face like they were looking for something lost. "That's the problem," Lucas murmured, and this time there was something different in his voice, something rougher, almost human. "You did." And before Ethan could step back, before he could say anything else, Lucas reached out, fingers brushing lightly against Ethan's wrist, a brief contact, barely there. And yet Ethan's entire body reacted like it meant something, like it always had, like it was supposed to, and that made no sense, none at all, because this was Lucas Vaughn, his enemy, his mistake, his contract. So why did it feel like he was the only one pretending the contact lingered for half a second too long? And Ethan pulled his hand back like he had touched something dangerous, his pulse tripping over itself as he stared at Lucas like the man had just broken some invisible rule he did not remember agreeing to. Because that was the problem. That was always the problem. Nothing here felt new, and yet none of it made sense. "Do not do that," Ethan said, his voice sharper now, steadier. But his fingers still tingled like the imprint of that brief touch had not quite faded, and that unsettled him more than anything else, because he had been in countless negotiations, shaken hundreds of hands, stood inches away from rivals and clients alike without a second thought. But this was different. This felt personal in a way he could not explain. Lucas did not apologize, did not even look surprised. He just watched Ethan with that same quiet intensity, like he was cataloging every reaction, every breath, every flicker of uncertainty. "You are already reacting," Lucas said simply, and there was no mockery in his tone, just something disturbingly certain. Ethan let out a short breath, shaking his head as he turned away, pacing once across the sleek office floor, his shoes soft against the polished surface, grounding himself in something real, something logical, because this was a contract, a business arrangement, a calculated move, not whatever this strange undercurrent was trying to become. "This is a legal agreement," Ethan said, more to himself than to Lucas, each word deliberate, controlled. "There are terms, boundaries, conditions, and whatever this clause is, it does not change the fact that this is temporary." He stopped, turning back, forcing himself to meet Lucas's gaze. "You needed a solution to your company's problem. I needed leverage. That is all this is." But even as he said it, there was a small, quiet voice in the back of his mind asking, "Then why does it feel like something is missing?" Lucas stepped closer again, not invading, not forcing, just closing the distance enough that Ethan had to tilt his chin slightly to maintain eye contact. And that small shift felt far too intimate for a room filled with glass and steel. "If that were all it was," Lucas said, his voice softer now, lower, "you would not be questioning it." Ethan opened his mouth to argue, to shut that down immediately, but the word stalled, caught somewhere between certainty and doubt, because he was questioning it. He had been since the moment he read that final line. A flicker of frustration sparked through him, and he looked away again, running a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly, deliberately, trying to reset, trying to reclaim control of a situation that was slipping into something he did not understand. "Then explain it," Ethan said finally, the challenge clear in his tone. "Explain why there is a clause that turns a contract into something permanent. Explain why you are acting like this is not the first time we have done this. Explain why you keep looking at me like I am supposed to remember something." The last sentence came out quieter than the rest, edged with something dangerously close to uncertainty. Lucas did not answer right away, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, layered, filled with something unspoken that seemed to stretch between them like a wire pulled too tight. For a moment, just a moment, Ethan thought Lucas might actually tell him, might finally make sense of all of this. But instead, Lucas's expression shifted, that brief openness sealing back into something controlled, something distant. "You will," Lucas said, and the certainty in those two words made Ethan's chest tighten. "Just not yet." Ethan frowned, irritation flaring again, because that was not an answer. That was not anything close to an answer. "That is not how this works," Ethan said, stepping back, reclaiming space, reclaiming distance. "I do not sign agreements I do not fully understand." Lucas's gaze followed him, steady, unwavering. "You already did," he replied, and there it was again, that quiet, unsettling truth that Ethan could not argue with, could not undo, because the ink was already dry, the contract already binding, and somewhere deep in his chest, beneath the logic and the anger and the carefully constructed control, there was that same impossible feeling, whispering that this was not the beginning of something new. It was the continuation of something he had somehow forgotten. The word continuation settled into Ethan's chest like something heavy and immovable, and for a second, he just stood there staring at Lucas, as if the answer might be written somewhere on his face if he looked long enough. But there was nothing there except that same calm certainty that made Ethan feel like he was already behind in a conversation he had not agreed to join. "No," Ethan said finally, more to himself than to Lucas, shaking his head. As he reached for something solid, something real, "that is not possible." Because people did not forget entire relationships. They did not misplace entire histories like a set of keys. That was not how memory worked. That was not how reality worked. And yet his pulse would not slow, his thoughts would not settle, because a part of him was not rejecting the idea. A part of him was recognizing it. He turned abruptly, grabbing the contract from the desk again, scanning it with sharper eyes this time, not just reading but searching, hunting for inconsistencies, for hidden clauses, for anything that would explain the strange weight pressing against his mind. The paper felt thicker than it should have, heavier, like it carried more than just ink and legal language. And Ethan's gaze snagged on something he had not noticed before, a faint indentation beneath the printed text, like there had been writing there once. Something pressed hard enough to leave a trace, but not visible anymore. His breath caught slightly as he angled the page toward the light, squinting, and for a brief second, just a flicker, he thought he saw it. His own name again, written in a slightly different slant, the signature not quite matching the one at the bottom. Ethan blinked, and it was gone. "What did you do?" he said quietly, not looking up this time, because if he looked at Lucas now he was not sure he would like what he saw behind him. Lucas exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost in the silence of the office, and when he spoke, his voice was lower, edged with something that had not been there before, something that sounded almost like restraint. "I gave you a choice," he said. Ethan let out a breath. That was closer to a laugh, though there was no humor in it, only disbelief. "You call this a choice?" he replied, finally turning back, holding up the contract slightly. "A document with a clause that traps me if I learn the truth, a situation where you clearly know more than you are saying, and you expect me to believe I agreed to this willingly." His voice rose just a fraction at the end, not losing control, but close enough that the edge was unmistakable. Lucas did not flinch, did not react. The way most people would when confronted, he simply watched Ethan with that same unsettling focus, as if every word Ethan spoke only confirmed something he already believed. "You did," Lucas said, and this time there was no hesitation, no pause, just certainty. "You asked for it." The words landed harder than anything else he had said so far, and Ethan felt something in his chest tighten sharply, because that did not just sound wrong, it sounded impossible, and yet the way Lucas said it made it feel like a memory Ethan could not quite reach. "Why would I ever agree to something like this?" Ethan demanded, his grip tightening on the paper again, the edges crinkling slightly under the pressure. "Why would I bind myself to you, of all people?" And there it was, the truth at the core of everything, the history between them, the rivalry, the distance that had always been there, solid and undeniable. Lucas's gaze shifted slightly at that, something flickering behind his eyes, something that looked almost like pain before it was gone, replaced again by that controlled calm. "Because you were running out of time," Lucas said quietly, and the room seemed to still around them, the air tightening again. "And you knew I was the only one who could help you." Ethan's breath hitched before he could stop it, the words striking somewhere deeper than logic, deeper than reason, because there was something in them that felt true in a way he could not explain, something that resonated like an echo of a moment he could not remember, and that terrified him more than anything else, because if Lucas was telling the truth, if any part of this was real, then the biggest question was no longer what Lucas had done. It was what Ethan himself had chosen to forget. The words settled in the air between them, and Ethan felt something shift inside his chest, subtle but undeniable, like a lock clicking one notch out of place, and he hated it. Hated the way his mind tried to fill in the gaps with fragments that did not belong to him. Hated the way his instincts were no longer lining up with his logic. "You are lying," Ethan said, but the certainty he usually carried in his voice was thinner now, stretched tight, because if Lucas was lying, then why did it feel like he was not? Lucas did not respond immediately, and that silence said more than any denial could have. It lingered, heavy and deliberate, pressing into the space where Ethan's confidence should have been. Ethan exhaled slowly, forcing himself to steady, to anchor, because this was exactly how people lost control, not through force, but through doubt, through the slow erosion of certainty. "Then prove it," Ethan added, lifting his chin slightly, reclaiming ground. "If I chose this, if I agreed to something this extreme, then there has to be evidence, something concrete, something that does not rely on whatever story you are trying to feed me." And there it was again, that edge, that need to pull this back into something measurable, something legal, something real. Lucas's gaze did not waver, but something in his expression shifted, not surprise, not hesitation, but calculation, as if he had anticipated this exact demand. There is, Lucas said, and the simplicity of the answer made Ethan's stomach tighten. For a moment, neither of them moved, and then Lucas turned slightly, reaching toward the side of the desk, his movements controlled, unhurried, like a man who knew exactly what he was about to reveal. Ethan watched him closely, every sense sharpening, every instinct alert, because this was the moment where things either made sense or fell apart completely. Lucas slid open a drawer and retrieved a thin folder, placing it on the desk between them without breaking eye contact. The gesture calm, almost casual, but the tension behind it was anything but. "You left this with me," Lucas said quietly. Ethan frowned, his gaze dropping to the folder, something in his chest tightening again. That same strange pull, like recognition brushing against the edges of his awareness. "I have never given you anything," Ethan replied, but even as he said it, the words felt less like a statement and more like a defense. Lucas did not argue, did not push. He simply nudged the folder slightly closer, an invitation rather than a command. The silence stretched again, thinner this time, sharper, until Ethan finally stepped forward, his movements slower than usual, more cautious, as if he was approaching something that might break or something that might break him. His fingers hovered over the folder for a second before he picked it up, the weight of it deceptively light, the surface smooth beneath his touch, and yet his pulse quickened as he opened it, because some part of him already knew this would not be empty. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once, and Ethan unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the page, reading the words, and then stopping, freezing, because the handwriting was unmistakably his. Not just similar, not just close, it was his, every stroke, every curve, every small imperfection exactly the way he wrote when he was not thinking about it. Ethan's breath caught, the world narrowing down to the page in his hands as the words blurred for a second before snapping back into focus. "If you are reading this, it means I do not remember." The line sat there, simple, direct, and something in Ethan's chest twisted painfully at the familiarity of it, because it sounded like him, it felt like him, and that was the worst part. His grip tightened slightly on the paper as he continued, slower now, more careful, like each word might shift beneath his gaze. "Do not trust your instincts. They will tell you to run. They will tell you he is the enemy. But that is not the truth. Not anymore." Ethan swallowed, his throat suddenly dry, his heartbeat loud in his ears, because this was not just a note. This was a message, a warning, and the realization settled in with quiet dread that whatever he had been before this moment, whatever choices he had made, they had been deliberate, calculated, and most terrifying of all, he had known exactly what he was about to lose. The paper trembled slightly in Ethan's hand, and he did not realize it until he forced his fingers to tighten, to still, because this was not possible. This could not be real, and yet every line on the page felt like it had been written with a version of him that existed just out of reach, a version that knew things he did not, a version that had made a decision he could not yet understand. He read the first line again, slower this time, letting each word settle. "If you are reading this, it means I do not remember," and something in his chest tightened with a strange, hollow familiarity, like hearing an echo of his own voice in a room he did not recognize. His gaze dropped to the next line, his breath shallow without him meaning it to be. "Do not trust your instincts. They will tell you to run. They will tell you he is the enemy. But that is not the truth. Not anymore." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry, because that was exactly what his instincts were screaming right now. Run. Get out. Do not let this go any further. And yet here he was, still standing, still reading, still trying to make sense of something that refused to fit into logic. He glanced up briefly, his eyes flicking to Lucas, searching for something, anything that would anchor this moment back into reality. But Lucas had not moved, had not interrupted. He was simply watching, his expression unreadable, but his attention unwavering. Like this mattered more than anything else in the room. Ethan looked back down at the page, his grip tightening slightly as he continued. "There is no time to explain everything. But you trusted him. You trusted Lucas." And the weight of that sentence hit harder than the rest, because trust was not something Ethan gave lightly, not to anyone, and certainly not to Lucas Vaughn, the man who had stood on the opposite side of every major decision in his career, the man who had challenged him, pushed him, forced him to sharpen every argument until it cut clean and precise. And yet, according to this, he had trusted him completely, enough to bind himself to him in a way that could not be undone. Ethan's mind raced, trying to reconcile the contradiction, trying to find the missing pieces that would make this make sense. But there was nothing, just blank space where something important should have been. His eyes moved to the final lines, slower now, more cautious, like he was bracing himself for something he could not predict. You asked him to keep you here. No matter what you say when you forget, even if you hate him for it, even if you try to leave, do not let him let you go. Ethan's breath caught sharply, the words settling deep, heavy, impossible to ignore, because that was not just a message, that was a command, a request, something desperate enough that he had felt the need to leave it behind for himself. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thicker, like the walls had shifted inward while he was not looking, and Ethan lowered the paper slowly, his gaze lifting again to Lucas. But this time there was no immediate challenge in his eyes, no sharp accusation, just a quiet, unsettling question that he could not voice yet. Lucas held his gaze, steady, patient, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment, as if everything up to now had been leading here. You expect me to believe this, Ethan said finally, but his voice was quieter now, less certain, the edges of his control worn down by something he could not fully grasp. Lucas did not step closer this time, did not reach for him again. He simply spoke, his voice low, deliberate. I expect you to recognize it. And that was worse, because belief could be argued, could be challenged, but recognition came from somewhere deeper, somewhere Ethan could not easily deny. His eyes dropped back to the page for a brief second, to the familiar lines of his own handwriting, to the version of himself who had known exactly what he was doing. And for the first time since this began, the question shifted, not what did Lucas do, not what is this contract, but why would I ever ask for this? And more importantly, what was so important that I chose to forget it in the first place? The question did not leave Ethan's mind. It settled there heavy and persistent, like something that refused to be ignored, and for a long moment, he said nothing, just stood there with the paper in his hand and the weight of his own words pressing against him from a past he could not reach. Because this was not just confusion anymore, this was intention, this was a version of himself making a deliberate choice and trusting someone he currently did not trust at all. What was I afraid of? Ethan asked finally, and this time the question was not sharp, it was quiet, almost careful, like he was testing something. Fragile, because fear implied urgency, fear implied a reason strong enough to override everything he believed about control and logic and self-preservation. Lucas did not answer immediately, and that hesitation felt different from before, not evasive, but measured, like he was deciding how much to say and how much to hold back. You were not afraid, Lucas said at last, his voice steady but softer than before. You were certain. And that answer made something twist in Ethan's chest, because certainty was worse than fear. Certainty meant he had known exactly what he was doing when he walked into this. Ethan let out a slow breath, his fingers loosening slightly on the paper as he tried to process that, because certainty meant this was not a mistake, it was not manipulation, it was not a trap, it was a decision, and that realization unsettled him more than anything else so far. Then tell me what I was certain about, Ethan said, his gaze lifting again, locking onto Lucas with renewed intensity, because if there was a truth buried under all of this, he needed to find it before whatever this contract was pulled him in deeper. Lucas took a step closer, then not abrupt, not forceful, just enough to narrow the space between them again, and Ethan did not move this time. He did not step back, he just watched him waiting. You were certain that if you left things the way they were, you would lose something you could not afford to lose, Lucas said quietly, and there was something in his tone now, something that edged closer to emotion than anything Ethan had heard from him yet. Ethan's brow furrowed slightly, because that was still too vague, too distant from anything he could grasp, and yet it pulled at something inside him like a thread he could not quite follow. That could mean anything. Ethan replied, though his voice lacked the sharpness it had before, because a part of him was already searching for what that something could be. Lucas's gaze did not waver, and for a moment something unguarded flickered there, something real, before it was carefully contained again. It was not anything, Lucas said, it was you. And the words landed with a quiet finality that made Ethan's breath catch, because that did not make sense. It did not fit into any logical structure he could build around this situation, and yet it felt like the most important piece of it. Ethan shook his head slightly, a reflex more than a decision, because his mind immediately rejected the idea even as something deeper responded to it. That does not make sense, he said, but the words sounded weaker now, less like a conclusion and more like a defense. Lucas exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping briefly to the paper still in Ethan's hand. Before returning to his face, "It did to you," he replied, and that quiet certainty was back again, stronger than before. The room fell silent once more, but this time it was different. It was not just tension, it was something shifting, something rearranging itself around a truth Ethan could not fully see yet, but could no longer ignore, because if this was about him, if he had been the one at risk, if he had been the one making this choice, then the contract was not just a tool, it was protection, and that changed everything, because it meant Lucas was not the threat Ethan had assumed. It meant the real danger was something else, something still hidden, just beyond his reach. And the thought settled into Ethan's mind, slow and heavy. If I asked him to keep me here, then what exactly was I trying to escape? The thought lingered in Ethan's mind, heavier than anything else that had been said so far, because escape implied danger, and danger implied something real, something present, something that had not disappeared just because his memory had. And for the first time since this began, the room did not feel like a place of negotiation anymore. It felt like a place he had been brought back to on purpose. Ethan's grip on the paper loosened slightly as he lowered it just enough to look at Lucas fully again. And this time his gaze was different, not defensive, not dismissive, but searching, because if Lucas was not the threat, then that meant Ethan had misunderstood the entire situation from the start. If I was trying to escape something, Ethan said slowly, each word measured, like he was building a structure he was not sure would hold, then it is still out there. The implication settled between them, immediate and undeniable, and for a brief moment something in Lucas's expression tightened just slightly before it smoothed out again. Yes, Lucas answered, and the simplicity of that response sent a quiet ripple through Ethan's chest, because there was no hesitation, no attempt to soften it, just confirmation. Ethan exhaled slowly, his thoughts shifting rapidly, now reorganizing everything he had assumed into something new, something less stable, but closer to the truth, and that unsettled him in a different way, because it meant this was not over, it had never been over. Then why do I not remember it? Ethan pressed his eyes, narrowing slightly as he studied Lucas, because this part mattered, this part was the key. If he had erased something from his own mind, then there had to be a reason, and that reason had to be strong enough to justify everything else. Lucas did not look away, and when he spoke this time his voice was quieter, more deliberate, like he understood exactly how important the answer was. "Because you said remembering would put you at risk," he said, and the words settled into Ethan's mind with a slow, cold clarity, because that was not fear, that was strategy, that was a decision made with full awareness of the consequences. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly as he processed that, because it meant this was not just about survival, it was about control, it was about choosing what to lose in order to protect something else. "So, I removed my own memory," Ethan said, more to himself than to Lucas, testing the shape of the idea, letting it settle into something that felt disturbingly plausible. Lucas inclined his head just slightly, not quite a nod, but enough to confirm it. The silence that followed was not empty, it was filled with the weight of realization, and Ethan felt something shift again inside his chest, something deeper this time, something that felt less like confusion and more like the beginning of understanding. "And you?" Ethan continued, his gaze sharpening again as it fixed on Lucas. "You agreed to this, you agreed to keep me here, even if I fought it, even if I tried to leave. Because that was what the note had said, that was what he had asked for, and the implications of that settled heavily between them." Lucas did not hesitate this time. "Yes," he said simply. Ethan studied him for a long moment, taking in the steadiness of his posture, the way he had not once tried to force him, the way he had allowed him to question everything without interruption, and something about that did not align with the image of an enemy Ethan had carried for years. "Why?" Ethan asked finally, and this time the question was not about the contract or the memory or the unknown threat, it was about Lucas himself, because none of this explained why he would agree to something like this, why he would take on that responsibility without hesitation. For a fraction of a second something flickered in Lucas's expression, something unguarded, something real, before it was carefully contained again, And when he spoke, his voice was lower than before, carrying a weight Ethan could not ignore. "Because you asked me to," he said, and the answer should have been simple, should have been enough, but it was. Not because there was something beneath it, something unsaid, something that made Ethan's chest tighten again, because people did not do this for someone they did not care about. And that realization settled in slow and unsettling as a new question formed quietly in his mind. If I trusted him enough to give him that kind of power, then what exactly was he to me? Before I forgot, the question lingered between them longer than it should have, and Ethan felt it settle somewhere deeper than logic, somewhere closer to instinct, because this was no longer just about contracts or memory or strategy. This was about connection, about a version of himself that had trusted Lucas in a way he could not currently understand, and that realization made something in his chest tighten in a way that was unfamiliar and unsettling. Ethan looked at him more carefully, now not as an opponent, not as a rival, but as a variable he had misjudged, and the shift was subtle but undeniable, because for the first time, he was not looking for weaknesses, he was looking for truth. "That is not enough," Ethan said quietly, not rejecting the answer, but not accepting it either, because people did not make decisions like this based on a request alone. There had to be something more, something that explained why Lucas had stayed, why he had followed through, why he was still here, now, instead of walking away. Lucas did not respond immediately, and that silence felt different this time, not controlled, not calculated, but restrained, like he was holding something back on purpose. And Ethan noticed at the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his gaze shifted just for a fraction of a second before settling back on Ethan's face. "It was enough," Lucas said finally, but his voice had changed, just slightly softer, lower, edged with something that felt less like certainty and more like control over something else. Ethan shook his head slowly, because no, that did not fit. It did not explain the weight behind all of this. It did not explain the way Lucas had been watching him since the beginning, like every reaction mattered, like every word carried more meaning than it should have. "You are still here," Ethan said, and this time his voice was sharper, not aggressive, but focused, because this was the part that did not make sense. If this was just about a contract, if this was just about following through on something I asked for, then you would not need to stay this close. You would not need to watch me like this. You would not need to answer every question I have like it matters. And there it was, the truth laid out clearly between them, because this was not neutral, this was not detached, this was personal. Lucas did not deny it, and that in itself was an answer, because silence in this moment was more revealing than any explanation could be. Ethan's pulse shifted slightly, not faster, not slower, just different, as his mind tried to align this new understanding with everything else he had learned in the last few minutes. And it did not fit cleanly, it did not resolve into something simple, it expanded instead, creating more questions, more possibilities, more things he was not ready to confront yet. "What was I to you?" Ethan asked, and this time the question was direct, no hesitation, no distance, because if he had trusted Lucas enough to give him control, then there had to be something there, something real, something that existed before all of this. The room felt still around them, the silence tightening again, but not with tension, this time with anticipation, because the answer to that question mattered in a way Ethan could not fully explain yet, but could not ignore either. Lucas's gaze held his steady, unflinching, and for a moment something unguarded surfaced. There's something that looked almost like conflict before it settled into something quieter, something more certain, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that Ethan felt immediately before he even processed the words. "You were not just someone I protected," Lucas said slowly, each word deliberate, measured, like he was choosing them carefully. "You were the reason I did not stop." And the meaning of that settled in Ethan's chest, not fully understood, not fully processed, but impossible to ignore, because that was not a professional answer, that was not a strategic explanation, that was something else, something that existed beyond contracts and obligations and logic, and it shifted something fundamental in the way Ethan saw him, because if that was true, then whatever had existed between them before this moment had not been simple, it had not been one-sided, and it had not been temporary, and the realization came quietly, but firmly. If I was the reason he stayed, then what exactly did I leave behind when I chose to forget him? The words did not leave Ethan's mind, they stayed there, echoing quietly, repeating in a way that made it impossible to dismiss, because that was not something you said about a rival or a partner or even an ally. That was something else entirely, something that carried weight, something that implied history, depth, and a connection that had not been accidental. Ethan did not speak right away. He just stood there watching Lucas, as if the answer might shift if he looked at him long enough. But it did not. Lucas remained steady, composed, controlled, and that only made the contrast sharper because what he had said did not match the distance he was maintaining now. That is not something people say lightly. Ethan said finally, his voice quieter, now less defensive, more analytical, because this was no longer about rejecting the situation, it was about understanding it, and every piece he uncovered only made it more complicated. Lucas did not respond immediately, but this time the silence felt heavier, not empty, but full, like there were too many things that could be said and none of them were simple enough to fit into a single sentence. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping briefly to the paper still in his hand, to the words he had written for himself, because if that version of him had trusted Lucas, then this version had to at least consider the possibility that there was a reason for it. If I was the reason you did not stop, Ethan continued, lifting his gaze again, his expression sharpening slightly. Then what exactly were you trying to stop? Because that was the missing piece, that was the part that connected everything together, and without it none of this made sense. Lucas's jaw tightened just slightly, the movement subtle but enough for Ethan to catch it, and that alone told him more than any immediate answer could have, because it meant this question mattered. It meant this was the line Lucas did not want to cross yet. Something that would have taken you away from me, Lucas said finally, and the simplicity of the statement only made it heavier, because it was not vague, it was not abstract, it was specific and personal, and that made Ethan's chest tighten again in a way he could not ignore. That still does not explain why I do not remember it, Ethan said quickly, because he needed to push back, needed to keep this grounded in something he could follow logically. If it was that important, then why erase it? Why risk losing the context entirely? Because that was the flaw in all of this, that was the part that still did not align. Lucas's gaze softened just slightly, and that change was subtle, but it shifted something in the room, something that made the air feel different, less tense, more weighted with something unspoken. Because remembering would have made you choose differently, Lucas replied, and the words landed quietly, but they carried a sharp edge because that implied something Ethan was not ready to face yet. Ethan frowned slightly, his mind immediately pushing back against that idea, because he did not make decisions like that. He did not choose based on emotion or fear or attachment. He chose based on logic, based on outcome, based on what made sense. I do not make choices like that, Ethan said firmly, the certainty returning to his voice even as something inside him hesitated. Lucas's expression did not change, but there was something in his eyes now, something that looked almost like recognition, mixed with something heavier, something that made Ethan's confidence feel less solid than it had a moment ago. You did, Lucas said quietly, and that quiet certainty unsettled Ethan more than any argument could have, because it did not try to convince him, it simply existed as fact. The silence that followed stretched longer this time, and Ethan felt it pressing in again, not uncomfortable, not overwhelming, but persistent, like something waiting for him to acknowledge it. He looked down at the note once more, at the lines written in his own hand, at the warning he had left himself, at the trust he had placed in Lucas, and something shifted again, slowly, steadily, as the pieces began to align in a way he could not fully deny anymore. Because if he had erased his memory to protect himself from making a different choice, then that meant the truth was not just dangerous, it was persuasive, and that realization settled deep and heavy, because it meant one thing very clearly: whatever I forgot is something that could still change everything if I remember it. The realization did not settle all at once, it spread slowly through Ethan's mind like something unfolding piece by piece, and the more he tried to ignore it, the clearer it became, because if the truth was persuasive enough to change his decision, then that meant whatever he had forgotten was not just dangerous, it was compelling, it was something that could pull him away from the very choice he had fought to make. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly around the paper as he lifted his gaze again to Lucas, his expression sharper, now more focused, because this was no longer about confusion, it was about control, about whether he still had it or whether he had already given it away. Then I need to know it, Ethan said, his voice steady, deliberate, because if knowledge was the risk, then withholding it was the manipulation, and he would not stand in a situation where he was being guided without understanding why. Lucas's expression shifted almost imperceptibly at that, not surprise, not resistance, but something closer to tension, like he had expected this moment, but had hoped it would come later. No, Lucas replied simply, and the refusal landed immediately, solid and unyielding. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly because that was not acceptable, not when everything pointed to the fact that this decision had been his to begin with. You do not get to decide that for me, Ethan said, stepping forward just enough to close the distance again, his presence firm, controlled, because this was where he drew the line. If I made this choice, then I made it with full information, which means I have the right to that information now. His voice did not rise, but the intensity behind it was clear, unmistakable. Lucas held his ground, not moving, not retreating, his gaze steady as it met Ethan's, and for a moment the air between them felt charged not with hostility, but with something more complex, something that refused to resolve into something simple. You told me not to tell you, Lucas said, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no doubt, just that same quiet certainty that had been present from the beginning. Ethan's breath caught slightly because that aligned with everything else, with the note, with the contract, with the pattern of control he was beginning to see, and yet it did not make it easier to accept. That was before. Ethan replied quickly, the logic immediate, even as something deeper hesitated. That was before I understood what was at stake. Because understanding changed things. Understanding gave context, gave control, gave the ability to make a real decision. Lucas's gaze did not waver, but there was something in it now, something heavier, something that made Ethan's confidence falter just slightly. You understood it better than you do now, Lucas said quietly, and that quiet statement carried more weight than any argument because it implied something Ethan was not prepared to accept, that his current perspective was incomplete, that his current certainty was less reliable than the one he had before. Ethan shook his head slightly, a reflexive rejection, because that challenged the very foundation of how he made decisions, how he trusted his own judgment. That does not make sense, he said, though the words felt thinner now, less grounded, because too many pieces were already aligning against that assumption. Lucas exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping briefly to the paper still in Ethan's hand before returning to his face. It will not until you reach the point where you chose this, he said, and the phrasing caught Ethan off guard because it was not about remembering, it was about reaching a point, about arriving somewhere, mentally, emotionally, strategically, that mirrored the decision he had already made once before. The silence that followed stretched again, but this time it was not empty, it was filled with the weight of a realization Ethan could not ignore, because if Lucas was right, then this was not a matter of being told the truth, it was a matter of understanding why the truth had been withheld in the first place, and that meant the answer was not something Lucas could give him, it was something Ethan had to arrive at on his own, and the thought settled slowly, but firmly. If I was willing to forget everything to make that choice, then what kind of truth was I protecting myself from hearing again? The idea settled deeper this time, not as a question, but as a possibility that refused to leave, and Ethan felt it press against the edges of his thoughts in a way that made it harder to breathe, not physically, but mentally, like something inside him was shifting to make space for a truth he had not been ready to face before. He did not move right away. He just stood there, the contract still in his hand, the note still open, his own handwriting staring back at him like a version of himself that had seen further than he could now, and that unsettled him more than anything Lucas had said. You are asking me to trust a decision I cannot remember making, Ethan said finally, his voice quieter now, but not weaker, just more controlled, more deliberate, because this was not about rejecting the situation anymore, it was about deciding whether he could move forward without understanding all of it. Lucas did not interrupt, and that silence gave Ethan space to continue to think, to analyze, to reconstruct something that had been deliberately taken apart. And you are refusing to give me the information that would explain it, Ethan added, his gaze lifting again, locking onto Lucas, because this part still mattered, this part still felt like control slipping out of his hands. Lucas's expression did not change, but there was something in his eyes now. Something that felt less like distance and more like restraint, like he was holding something back, not to manipulate, but to protect, and that distinction mattered more than Ethan wanted it to. Ethan exhaled slowly, his grip on the paper loosening slightly, as his thoughts shifted again, because this was not a simple imbalance of power, this was something he had designed, something he had agreed to, something he had enforced himself. Then there is only one reason I would do that, Ethan said, more to himself than to Lucas, his voice quieter as the logic settled into place piece by piece. I did not trust myself with the truth. And saying it out loud made something in his chest tighten, because that was not something he admitted easily, not even internally. Lucas did not confirm it directly, but the absence of denial was enough, and Ethan felt that answer settle into him heavier than anything else so far, because it reframed everything not as a trap, not as manipulation, but as a system he had built to control his own decisions. Ethan ran a hand slowly through his hair, his thoughts racing not chaotically, but sharply aligning around this new understanding, because if he had removed the truth from himself, then that meant the real conflict was not between him and Lucas, it was between two versions of himself, one that had known everything and one that was trying to piece it back together. So what happens now? Ethan asked finally, and this time the question was not a challenge, it was genuine, because if he could not be told the truth, and he could not remember it, then there had to be a path forward, there had to be a way to reach that same conclusion again, without breaking whatever protection he had put in place. Lucas's gaze held his steady, and for a moment there was something almost reassuring in that steadiness, something that Ethan had not expected to find there. Now you decide if you trust the version of yourself who chose this, Lucas said, and the simplicity of that answer made Ethan's chest tighten again, because it shifted the responsibility back onto him completely, not as a victim, not as someone being guided, but as someone who had already made a decision and now had to choose whether to honor it. The silence that followed was different this time, not tense, not uncertain, but heavy with the weight of that choice, because there was no easy answer, no immediate resolution, just the quiet realization that this was not about uncovering the past, it was about deciding the future, and Ethan felt that settle into him slowly, firmly, as the question formed clearly in his mind. If I do not remember why I chose him, then the only thing that matters now is whether I would choose him again. The question did not disappear, it stayed there, steady and persistent, echoing through Ethan's thoughts, because it was no longer about what had been lost, it was about what he would choose now, without the weight of memory guiding him, and that made everything sharper, more immediate, more real. Ethan stood still for a moment longer, the silence stretching around him, but it did not feel suffocating anymore. It felt focused, like the entire situation had narrowed down to a single point of decision, and for the first time since this began, he was not reacting, he was thinking. His gaze shifted slowly back to Lucas, not searching, not questioning, just observing, because if this was about choice, then he needed to see clearly, not through the lens of past assumptions, not through the instinct that told him this man was an enemy, but through what was actually in front of him now. Lucas had not moved, his posture still composed, his expression still controlled, but there was something else there now, something quieter, something that had not been visible when this began, something that felt less like distance and more like restraint, like he was holding himself back in a way that mattered. Ethan noticed the details, the way Lucas had not once tried to force his hand, the way every answer had been given without pressure, without manipulation, the way he had allowed Ethan to question everything even when it would have been easier to shut it down, and that did not align with the version of Lucas he remembered, because that version had always been sharp, direct, unyielding. This Lucas was different, not weaker, not uncertain, but deliberate in a way that suggested choice, not necessity. If I chose you once, Ethan said slowly, his voice steady as the thought formed clearly for the first time, then there was a reason strong enough to override everything else I believed. And saying it out loud made something shift again, because it reframed the situation not as something done to him, but something he had decided for himself. Lucas did not respond immediately, and Ethan realized he was waiting not for an answer, but for something else, for Ethan to finish the thought on his own. Ethan exhaled slowly, his fingers loosening on the paper completely now as he let it fall back onto the desk, because he did not need to hold on to it anymore, not in the same way. And if I remove the memory of that reason, Ethan continued, his gaze holding steady on Lucas now, then it means I trusted the outcome more than the process. Because that was the only explanation that fit, the only logic that aligned with the version of himself he knew, even if he could not remember the specifics. Lucas's eyes flickered slightly at that, not surprise, but recognition, like Ethan had reached something important, something that mattered. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full of understanding, not complete, not resolved, but enough to move forward. Ethan took a small step closer this time, not out of instinct, not out of reaction, but out of choice, and the distance between them shifted again, but differently than before, less charged, more grounded. So this is what I have, Ethan said, his voice quiet, but clear, because this was the first time he was stating something without doubt. I do not remember why I chose this, I do not know what I was trying to protect myself from, and I do not know what I gave up to get here. He paused just briefly, not hesitating but acknowledging the weight of it before continuing. But I know that I made the decision with full awareness, and I know that I trusted you enough to follow through with it. And that last part settled between them heavier than anything else, because it was not based on memory, it was based on logic, on pattern, on everything Ethan had observed since the beginning. Lucas did not speak, but there was something in his expression on anything Ethan could not remember. Then I will not ask for the truth, Ethan said finally, his voice calm, controlled, but carrying a quiet weight, because this was not avoidance, this was intention. Not yet. He added, and the slight shift in Lucas's expression told him that the distinction mattered. Ethan took another step forward, closing the distance fully now, not out of uncertainty, but out of clarity, because hesitation no longer served him here. If I chose this once, then I had a reason strong enough to remove everything that would have made me hesitate. He continued, his voice steady as the logic aligned fully in his mind, which means if I want to understand it, I need to reach that same point again, not force it, not shortcut it, but arrive there on my own. And saying it out loud made the path forward feel real, something he could follow instead of something he had to guess. Lucas did not interrupt, did not argue, and that silence felt different this time, not distant, not guarded, but open. Like he was allowing Ethan to take the lead in a way that had not been possible before. Ethan exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly as the uncertainty shifted into something more focused, more controlled. So this is what we do. He said, his gaze unwavering now, because this was no longer a question, it was a decision. We follow the contract, we let this play out the way I intended it to, and I figure out why I chose you without breaking whatever protection I put in place. The words settled between them, firm, grounded, impossible to misunderstand. For a moment, Lucas did not move, and then something shifted in his posture, not dramatic, not obvious, but enough that Ethan could feel it, the difference between holding something back and letting it stand as it was. And if you do not reach the same conclusion, Lucas asked quietly, and there was something in his voice now, something that had not been there before, something that felt less like certainty and more like risk. Ethan considered that for a fraction of a second, not dismissing it, not avoiding it, because this was part of the decision too. This was the part where outcome mattered, where choice had consequences. Then I walk away, Ethan said simply, because anything else would not be honest, would not align with the logic he was building this on. And he did not look away when he said it. He did not soften it or adjust it, because if this was going to mean anything, it had to be real. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with that statement, with the weight of it, with the understanding that this was not guaranteed, that this was not controlled in the way it had been before. Lucas held his gaze for a long moment, and then nodded once, not reluctantly, not forcefully, but with a quiet acceptance that settled something deeper than words could. Ethan felt that acknowledgement in a way he could not fully explain, because it was not just agreement, it was trust returned in a different form, something that existed without memory, without history, but not without meaning. He glanced briefly at the contract on the desk, at the ink that had already sealed this arrangement, and for the first time since he had read that final clause, it did not feel like a trap, it felt like a path, something designed not to confine him, but to guide him somewhere he had already decided was worth reaching. When he looked back at Lucas, there was no hesitation left in his expression, only that same quiet certainty that had begun to take shape moments ago. Then we begin again, Ethan said, and the words settled into the space between them, not as a restart, not as something new, but as a continuation of something that had never fully ended, even if he could not remember it, because this time the choice was not about the past, it was about the future, and whether he would arrive at the same truth all over again.